How did a few hundred teenagers, boys who had been digging sewage trenches and unloading supply ships just weeks earlier, stop the most decorated, most feared, most battle-hardened army in the entire Pacific from reaching its objective? Their own generals called them chocolate soldiers, men who would melt the moment the heat came. Japan's South Seas Detachment had marched through Manchuria, crushed the garrison at Rabaul, and seized Guam without suffering a single serious reversal. Now they were advancing through the most savage jungle on Earth with Port Moresby and the entire strategic future of the Pacific War within reach. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Kokoda Track before today? Watch this until the very end, because what these boys did in the mountains of Papua in 1942, and what their own high command did to them afterward, is one of the most extraordinary and infuriating stories in the history of warfare. And almost nobody outside Australia knows it happened. To understand what was at stake in those dripping, lightless jungles, you must first understand the world that produced the crisis. By the beginning of 1942, the entire architecture of Western power in the Pacific had not merely been challenged, it had been demolished. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, did more than destroy American battleships. It announced, in the language of burning steel and screaming aircraft, that the assumptions upon which every Allied strategic plan in the Pacific rested were worthless. Everything that had been considered impossible had just happened in a single morning. What followed was a cascade of disasters that accelerated with a momentum that left Allied commanders genuinely unable to absorb one catastrophe before the next arrived. Singapore fell on the 15th of February, 1942. 85,000 Allied soldiers surrendered to a Japanese force that was numerically smaller and had been fighting for weeks through difficult terrain on a logistical shoestring. Winston Churchill called it the greatest disaster in British military history, and he was not being dramatic. For Australia, the fall of Singapore was something more visceral than a military defeat. It was the moment the imperial shield shattered. The assumption that a friendly great power would always stand between Australia and any threat from the north, an assumption that had shaped Australian defense policy and Australian psychology for a generation, proved in a single afternoon to have been a fantasy. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen in 70 days. Less than a week later, on the 19th of February, 188 Japanese aircraft struck Darwin in the largest single attack ever launched against the Australian mainland. More aircraft hit Darwin that morning than had struck Pearl Harbor. The government suppressed the true scale of the destruction for weeks, terrified of the panic the real numbers would generate. That suppression was its own kind of testimony, an admission that the psychological damage of the truth might be more dangerous than the physical damage of the bombs. Australia was, in a very real sense, alone. Its experienced soldiers, the men of the 6th and 7th Divisions of the 2nd AIF, blooded in the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Greece, were fighting overseas in someone else's war. Winston Churchill attempted to divert the 7th Division to Burma as it sailed home from the Middle East, arguing that the strategic needs of the empire demanded it. Prime Minister John Curtin refused. It was perhaps the single most important act of Australian political courage in the entire war, achieved against enormous pressure from the most powerful figure in the British war effort. The 7th Division came home. The decision would prove critical in ways that neither Curtin nor Churchill could have fully anticipated when they argued over it. What was left in Australia in early 1942 was the militia. Conscripts, part-time soldiers, men who had been mobilized but who had been given more shovels than rifles, more construction assignments than training exercises. They were the other army, the Second Army, and in the professional culture of the AIF, they were regarded with a contempt so casual it had acquired its own vocabulary. They were called chocos, chocolate soldiers, men expected to melt the moment the fighting started. The slur was delivered with the easy confidence of people who had never questioned it, and it settled over the militia like a second uniform. The Japanese, meanwhile, were not consulting Australia's internal military hierarchy. Their objective was Port Moresby, the capital of Australian Papua, the hub of Allied air operations in the Southwest Pacific, and the geographic key to everything that would follow. Their first attempt to take it had been by sea. A Japanese naval invasion fleet set out for Port Moresby in May of 1942. Allied codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher, and a carrier group was waiting. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought from the 4th to the 8th of May, was the first naval engagement in history, where neither fleet ever saw the other, every blow struck by aircraft alone. The Japanese won a tactical victory, but lost so many aircraft that they were forced to abandon the invasion and return to Rabaul. The sea route to Port Moresby was closed. So the Japanese looked at their maps and found something they had learned about from vague explorers' accounts. A narrow track across the Owen Stanley Range, one of the most formidable mountain chains in the world. A foot track. A single-file path through jungle so dense it blocked the sun, rising to over 2,190 meters above sea level, falling in the valleys to swampy lowlands thick with malaria and crocodiles. The Japanese planners called it the Kokoda Gap, and they believed it might offer a corridor for a rapid advance to Port Moresby from the north. They were wrong about the speed, but they were right about the corridor. And on the 9th of June, 1942, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific, headquartered hundreds of kilometers away in Melbourne, finally asked his subordinates what was protecting that overland approach. The answer was a single militia battalion and a handful of Papuan soldiers. Orders were issued to develop an airfield at Buna on the north coast. Those orders arrived on the 17th of July. The Japanese landed at Gona and Buna 4 days earlier, on the 21st. The response that was supposed to prevent what followed was already overtaken by events before it was issued. The Kokoda Track runs 96 kilometers overland through the Owen Stanley Range, though the straight-line distance is closer to 60. The difference between those two figures is a lesson in the terrain. The track does not go around mountains. It goes over them, and then up the next one, and down and up again, accumulating an elevation change of close to 5,000 meters across its full length. At its highest point, at altitude in the tropics, nights drop near freezing. Rain falls every afternoon, cascading into whatever hollow or depression the soldiers have managed to convert into a fighting position. The mud is not ordinary mud. It is a substance that consumes energy, that swallows boots, that reaches a consistency somewhere between concrete and quicksand, depending on the hour. Below the ridgelines, the vegetation is so dense that sunlight does not reach the ground in most sections. Visibility is 20 to 30 meters. A man can walk past an enemy position at 15 meters and never know it is there. The forest is alive with leeches that attach themselves in dozens, with mosquitoes carrying the malaria that would eventually evacuate more soldiers from this campaign than Japanese bullets, with scrub typhus, with dysentery that could reduce a fighting man to helplessness within days. Snakes, crocodiles in the river crossings. The journalist Osmar White, who covered the campaign, described the Owen Stanleys as full of malaria, ague, dysentery, scrub typhus, and obscure diseases, and kept listing. There are not many battlefields in military history where the environment itself accumulates a body count before the first shot is fired. Before 1942, almost no Europeans used this track. Those who needed to cross the Owen Stanley Range did so by aircraft. The only regular foot traffic was government patrol officers and local villagers, and distances were measured not in kilometers, but in the days a patrol officer needed to walk from one government station to the next. At the northern end of the track, in the foothills above the north coast, sat the village of Kokoda. Its strategic value came entirely from the plateau beside it, where a small airstrip had been cut from the jungle. It was the only airfield between Port Moresby and the Japanese beachheads. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled air supply to the campaign. Whoever controlled air supply survived. Whoever lost it was fighting blind, hungry, and increasingly alone. Lieutenant Don Simonson of the 39th Battalion, arriving at the track for the first time in July of 1942, recalled it simply. Well, we moved into a country that we had never dreamt of before. The 39th Battalion had been formed in Victoria in October and November of 1941 from local militia units. Its soldiers were ordinary young men from Victoria's towns and suburbs. Their average age was in the early 20s. Many were teenagers, sent to Port Moresby not as a fighting force but as a garrison, men to dig holes, unload ships, and build the infrastructure that a wartime base required. They had received more picks and shovels than rifle training. Some had been told they were heading to North Queensland. They were diverted to New Guinea en route. Without explanation, Christmas leave canceled. The disaffection this created was real, documented, and cited by later analysts as a genuine factor in the morale problems that would follow. It is difficult to feel surprised. The cultural weight bearing down on these men was considerable. In the professional world of the AIF, the militia were an embarrassment, soldiers in name but not in substance, expected to perform badly when tested and therefore never truly prepared for the test. The word Chaco was not merely casual slang, it was a verdict delivered in advance. What is remarkable, looking back, is not that some of them struggled under that weight. It is that so many refused to. There was a crucial distinction within the 39th that would prove decisive. Its officers had taken training seriously. They drilled, they practiced, they tried, within the considerable constraints of their situation, to build soldiers out of the material they had. The 53rd Battalion, which would be deployed alongside the 39th on the track, had officers who treated the posting as something closer to an inconvenience. The consequences of that difference, when the fighting started, were stark and predictable, and, for the men caught inside the 53rd, heartbreaking. They were also one of the clearest demonstrations of an argument that ran through Australian military culture for years afterward. There are no bad soldiers, only bad officers. B Company of the 39th arrived at Kokoda on the 14th of July after a 7-day march through the jungle. They were exhausted before they had seen an enemy. They set up their positions around the airstrip and prepared, with what they had, to defend it. They were doing this against an army that had rolled over everything it had previously encountered. Major General Tomitaro Horii was 51 years old when the Japanese landed at Gona. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1911, served in China, commanded the seizure of Guam in December of 1941 and overseen the destruction of the Australian garrison at Rabaul in January of 1942. His South Seas Detachment, the Nankai Shitai, were veterans of campaigns from Manchuria to the Central Pacific, among the most experienced jungle fighters in the Japanese order of battle. Hori rode a groomed white thoroughbred horse. He had issued his troops a personal guide to conduct in the field, the Guide to Soldiers in the South Seas, forbidding needless killing of civilians, prohibiting looting, banning violence against women, and demanding the careful conservation of ammunition. The directive was unusual for the Imperial Army. It spoke to a commander who understood discipline as a military asset. The dark shadow on his record sat alongside this portrait without resolving it. At Toll Plantation on the 15th of February, 160 Australian prisoners of war from the Rabaul garrison were killed by forces under Hori's command. The man who issued directives against needless killing was responsible for a deliberate atrocity against surrendered soldiers. These facts do not cancel each other. They constitute a portrait. His force arrived in Papua equipped with mountain artillery, 37mm, 70mm, and 75mm guns, heavy machine guns his troops called woodpeckers, and mortars. Getting those mountain guns across the Owen Stanley Range required approximately 940 men simply to carry them. That is the measure of how seriously Hori valued his firepower advantage. He was right to value it. The official Australian historian later calculated that approximately 35% of all Australian casualties in the campaign were caused by Japanese artillery alone. The Australians had none. The initial plan had not been a full-scale offensive. The 15th Independent Engineer Regiment, which landed first, was supposed to assess whether the Kokoda Track was a viable route for a major advance. When they made contact with elements of the Papuan Infantry Battalion and the 39th at Awala on the 23rd of July, the probing mission escalated into something neither side had planned for. By the 24th of July, more than 4,000 Japanese troops were ashore. Maroubra Force, the combined Australian and Papuan units defending the track, numbered approximately 420 dispersed men. Japanese Imperial Headquarters formally authorized a full offensive around the 13th of August. By then, the fighting had already been going on for 3 weeks. The first major test came at Kokoda itself. Colonel Owen flew in to take personal command of B Company's defense of the airstrip. On the night of the 26th of July, the Japanese attacked. Owen was shot through the head while defending his position. Whether he was leaning out of a weapon pit to return fire or was struck while directing his men depends on which account you read, and the accounts differ. He died the following morning, the first commanding officer the campaign consumed. Without him, the 80-odd men defending Kokoda had no intact command structure, dwindling ammunition, and Japanese forces closing from multiple directions. Kokoda village fell on the 29th of July. The airfield was in enemy hands. What followed was a fighting withdrawal of a particular kind of anguish. Not a rout, not a collapse. A deliberate, grinding, step-by-step retreat along a track that offered no mercy to either side, buying time in the currency of lives. The 39th fell back from Kokoda to Diniki, temporarily recaptured the village on the 8th of August before being driven back again, then south into the mountains through a series of rearguard engagements where small numbers of exhausted men held positions against forces that should have swept them aside, and sometimes were swept aside, and regrouped and held again somewhere further back. The supply chain was an active accomplice in the disaster. Only about a quarter of the food and ammunition needed at the front was actually reaching the men through the carrier chain. Airdrops had begun in August, but aircraft were scarce, and not all drops could be retrieved from the jungle. A dysentery epidemic began in mid-August near Yoribaiwa and spread up and down the track with terrible efficiency. For 2 months, between 30 and 80 men per day, from a force that at any given time numbered between 2,000 and 3,000, were evacuated sick. By the 27th of December, 4,857 Australians had been removed from the front line due to illness. That figure exceeded the total who had been evacuated with wounds. More than half of every Australian who fought in this campaign was eventually taken off the line not by Japanese bullets, but by the Owen Stanley Range itself. Among the more counterintuitive facts of those months is that the Japanese, in the campaign's early phase, suffered less from disease than the Australians. A post-war Australian study described the Nankai Shitai as the most inoculated army in the world. To the end of September, the Australians had evacuated 1,752 men, sick against 343 Japanese. The disparity would reverse catastrophically when Japanese supply lines collapsed in October and November. But through August and September, the Australians were fighting simultaneously against Hori's veterans and against the environment itself, and the environment was winning. The 53rd Battalion arrived to reinforce, and what happened at Abuari was the predictable consequence of sending men into combat before they were ready. Their attacks were confused and ultimately ineffective. The responsibility for that failure belonged to the institution that had deployed them prematurely, not to the frightened young men who found themselves in an impossible situation. But its consequence was that the 39th continued to face what was coming without the reinforcement it had been promised. By mid-August, the survivors had withdrawn to Isurava, a village on the northern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range. They dug their fighting positions with bayonets, bully beef tins, and steel helmets because they had no proper entrenching tools. The canopy above them blocked the sun. The afternoon rain fell into their weapon pits and soaked the clothes they wore, the only clothes they had. At night, the temperature dropped near freezing, and there was nothing dry to change into. Private Stuart Clark of the 39th wrote in his diary, "Pushing on, heavy mud track, rain, 5 words that contained weeks." Into this, on the 16th of August, 1942, arrived Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor. Born on the 17th of August, 1904, in Fremantle, Western Australia, Honor was a school teacher and later a lawyer. Quiet, deeply intelligent, a man who thought before he spoke and meant precisely what he said when he spoke. He had served with the 2nd AIF in the Middle East, fought through the catastrophic withdrawal from Greece, survived the defeat in Crete, and been awarded the Military Cross for his conduct during the Greek campaign. He knew what it looked like when an army was coming apart. He knew what it took to hold one together. He arrived at Isurava the day before his 38th birthday. His assessment of what he found was precise and unflinching. Physically, the pathetically young warriors of the 39th were in poor shape. Worn out by strenuous fighting and exhausting movement, and weakened by lack of food, sleep, and shelter, many had literally come to a standstill. Practically every day, torrential rain fell all through the afternoon and night, cascading into their cheerless weapons pits and soaking the clothes they wore, the only ones they had. His second in command, Major Cameron, met him and delivered his verdict on B Company. They lacked courage. They should be broken up and their men distributed among the other companies. Cameron had watched them buckle under pressure and concluded they were beyond recovery. Hunter walked the ground. He studied B Company's position on the exposed high ground to the left of the track, where the terrain fell away in near vertical drops and the men had been under probing Japanese attacks for days. He assessed what he was looking at. Then he told Cameron, plainly, that he would not break up B Company. He would work with what he had, and he expected them to hold. Then he went to B Company and delivered the same message, not as encouragement, but as certainty. They would hold. It is worth understanding what that decision meant. Hunter was not making a gesture. He had looked at these exhausted, hungry, poorly equipped teenagers and concluded that they possessed something Cameron's assessment had missed. He staked his judgment and potentially the success of the entire defensive position on that conclusion. The calculation was not obvious. It was not safe. He made it anyway. The 10 days before the main assault were a sustained provocation. Continuous Japanese probing attacks. Patrols clashing in the jungle around Isarava in confusing, terrifying skirmishes where men were cut off from their units for days without food, without communications, and without any realistic hope of reinforcement. It was a baptism in jungle warfare of the most brutal possible kind. Through it, the 39th held. On the 26th of August, the first elements of the 2nd 14th Battalion began arriving at Isarava, AIF regulars, veterans of North Africa, Greece, and Crete, men with serious combat experience. They came piecemeal, in small groups, still depleted from an exhausting march over the mountains, and were fed directly into the line as they arrived. The relief Hunter had been waiting for was real, and it was coming. It was arriving at exactly the same moment as the storm. At dawn on the 26th of August, Hori's main force struck. The mountain guns opened first. The woodpeckers, the heavy machine guns that had been carried over the Owen Stanleys at such enormous cost, began chopping through the trees. Then the infantry came in waves. Hunter described what happened with the directness of a man who was inside it. The enemy came on in waves over a short stretch of open ground, regardless of casualties. They were met with Bren gun and Tommy gun, with bayonet and grenade. But still they came, to close with the buffet of fist and boot and rifle butt, the steel of crashing helmets and of straining, strangling fingers. Vicious fighting, man to man, hand to hand. B Company, on the exposed high ground that Cameron had wanted to abandon, held. Under assault that most military assessments would have rated unsurvivable, the boys that Hunter had been told lacked courage held their ground through the 26th and through the 27th, most of them wounded, many of them killed, the survivors still fighting. The high ground did not fall. On the 28th of August, Hori opened the day with his mountain guns again. Waves of infantry followed the bombardment into hand-to-hand combat across the position. Clark wrote in his diary that night, "Bullets everywhere, hell on earth amongst the clouds in the mountains." Then came the 29th. The Japanese struck the right flank of the 2nd 14th with concentrated force, broke through it, and poured toward the battalion's headquarters. If that headquarters fell, the command structure holding the entire position together collapsed with it. The call went out for volunteers to counterattack. Private Bruce Steele Kingsbury stepped forward. He was 24 years old, born on the 8th of January 1918 in Melbourne, the second son of a real estate agent, a young man who had preferred the bush to the city, who had worked on sheep stations in New South Wales with his boyhood friend Alan Avery, and who had enlisted alongside Avery in May of 1940. He was one of the few survivors of his own platoon, already overrun. His unit was gone. He could have stayed with the remnants and waited. He did not wait. He took a Bren gun and ran toward the Japanese position, alone, firing from the hip through concentrated machine gun fire. He cleared a path through the enemy, men falling on both sides of his charge. He stopped, turned, waited for his mates to catch up. Sergeant Alan Avery watched every step and recorded what he saw with the simple precision of a man determined to make sure the truth was preserved exactly. You could see his Bren gun held out and his big bottom swaying as he went with the momentum he was getting up. Kingsbury saw more Japanese ahead. He moved forward again without waiting for the others. A sniper fired. Kingsbury fell. He was dead when Avery reached him. The counterattack consolidated the ground he had won. Battalion headquarters survived. The official citation concluded that his act undoubtedly saved battalion headquarters, language that carries military understatement the way a dam carries water. 7 Section, 9 Platoon of the 2nd 14th would end the war as the most decorated section in the entire British Empire. 1 Victoria Cross, 1 Distinguished Conduct Medal, 4 military medals. The men who fought together that day and those that followed had accumulated a collection of honors that no other section in the whole of the empire would match. Kingsbury's Victoria Cross was the first awarded on Australian soil. He is buried at Bomana War Cemetery in Port Moresby. His Victoria Cross is on display at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. A suburb of Melbourne bears his name. His rock, the specific rock beside which he fell on the 29th of August, stands inside the Isurava Memorial today. The battle raged through that afternoon. D Company, astride the track, broke around 3 o'clock after repulsing 11 previous attacks on its position. Elements of the 2nd 14th gave way under the accumulated weight of pressure. Honor conducted a withdrawal of just over a kilometre to positions around the Isurava rest house, with Australian groups fighting their way out through the jungle as the Japanese closed in behind them. When the 2nd 14th mustered at Alola the following morning, 172 men were unaccounted for beyond the confirmed dead and wounded. The final toll at Isurava, 99 Australians killed, 111 wounded. Hori had driven them back. He had not destroyed them. The plan had been the annihilation of Maroubra force. He had pushed them south at significant cost to himself, but they were still fighting. The withdrawal continued through August and into September. Every position held a little longer than seemed possible. Every position eventually yielded. Yora Creek, Templeton's Crossing, Efoji, Mission Ridge. Each name became, in the memory of the men who fought there, a word for a specific shade of exhaustion and loss. Brigadier Arnold Potts, commanding the 21st Brigade, conducted what military historians have since assessed as a masterful series of rearguard actions. Each position held precisely long enough to cost Hori time and men and supplies before ceding ground to the next defensible feature. MacArthur, watching from Melbourne, called it retreat. Potts was managing the terms of a campaign. The difference was invisible from headquarters. By the 14th of September, Japanese forward observers at Yorubaiwa Ridge could see the lights of Port Moresby twinkling in the darkness 40 kilometers to the south. They could see the objective. It felt, to men who had fought and marched and starved their way across the Owen Stanley Range for weeks, as though the end was within reach. They were looking at a city they would never enter. Hori's force was starving. The decision to turn a reconnaissance mission into a full-scale offensive had outrun everything the Japanese supply system could actually sustain. The men had been told they could supplement their rations with food abandoned in Australian positions along the track. They found very little. Air resupply was drastically inadequate for the scale of the operation. The mountain guns that had been their decisive advantage required hundreds of men to maintain their ammunition supply, men who had to be fed from the same collapsing chain. The whole structure of the offensive had been built on an assumption about the duration of the campaign that the Owen Stanley Range had refused to accept. On the 23rd of September, 1942, Hori received orders to withdraw to the north coast. The formal trigger was the catastrophic Japanese defeat on Guadalcanal, where American Marines had landed in August and inflicted losses that Imperial headquarters could no longer ignore. Losses severe enough that the resources required to reinforce New Guinea simply did not exist. Hori required confirmation from Imperial General Headquarters before he would give up ground his men had bled to take. That requirement, and the pause it caused, says something about how much the advance had cost him. The post-war testimony of Japanese officers who survived the campaign complicates the neat narrative of Guadalcanal as the sole cause. Lieutenant General Tsutomu Yoshihara, Chief of Staff of Japan's South Seas Army, attributed the halt to what he described as stronger than anticipated Australian resistance at Kokoda. Both explanations contain truth. The battles from Izurava southward had bled Hori's logistics dry enough that reaching Port Moresby without massive reinforcement was impossible. Guadalcanal denied him that reinforcement. The Australian resistance created the conditions. The strategic shift made them decisive. Had Maroubra force collapsed in August, the Japanese would have reached Port Moresby before Guadalcanal had anything to spend. Australian artillery was now in range of Imita Ridge, the last defensible position before Port Moresby, and the supply line from the south had been improved enough that the balance of logistics had shifted in the Australians' favor for the first time. On the 24th of September, the day after the withdrawal order reached Hori, the Japanese pulled back from Yorubaiwa. The 25th Brigade advanced from Imita Ridge, moving north up the same track on which Australian soldiers had retreated for months. The Japanese fought them every step of the way, rearguard actions as determined in withdrawal as the advance had been in assault. Kokoda village was retaken on the 2nd of November. Hori did not live to see the final collapse. Trapped on the wrong side of the flooded Kamusi River, as the Australians advanced from the south, he attempted to raft downstream with a small party to reach the Japanese beachheads on the coast. The raft snagged on submerged trees. He transferred to a canoe. A storm struck off the New Guinea coast. The canoe capsized in the dark. His orderly reported his final words before the water took him. "I haven't the strength to swim any further. Tell the troops that Hori died here. Long live the Emperor. His body was never recovered." He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general. The man who had led the Pacific's unbeaten force within sight of its greatest prize died in a flooded river, fleeing the army he had underestimated. At Oivigorari, fought from the 4th to the 11th of November, the remaining strength of the Nankai Shitai was broken in a decisive engagement. One military analyst wrote of it afterward that if he were to identify the single moment when the war turned irrevocably against the Japanese in the Pacific, it was at Oivigorari on the 5th of November, 1942. Rarely after that engagement would the Japanese fight Australian troops in open battle and survive. The survivors who reached the coast arrived, in the accounts of those who witnessed them, naked or in rags, in near skeletal condition, the remnants of an army that had been promised a quick conquest and had found something else entirely. What happened to the Australians who had stopped them belongs to a different category of story, not the enemy's defeat, but an ally's betrayal. General Sir Thomas Blamey, Commander-in-Chief of the Australian military forces, arrived in New Guinea as the campaign drew toward its end. MacArthur had sent him to demonstrate that the failures that had occurred would not be tolerated. Blamey, whose own headquarters had been in Melbourne while his soldiers died in the mountains, understood the political logic of his position. The action he chose was to remove the commanders who had saved Port Moresby. General Rowell was relieved. Brigadier Arnold Potts, who had conducted the fighting withdrawal that cost Horii weeks and thousands of casualties, was removed from command and sent back to Australia. General Arthur Allen was replaced. Virtually every senior Australian officer who had managed the campaign successfully was discarded. In early November, Blamey addressed the survivors of Maroubra Force at Koitaki, near Port Moresby. These were men who had been in the Owen Stanley Range for months. They stood in ranks and waited for what soldiers always wait for after something like this: acknowledgement, recognition that what they had endured had been seen and understood by the people who had sent them into it. Blamey told them they had been beaten by inferior forces. He told them no soldier should be afraid to die. Then he told them, in phrasing confirmed by multiple witnesses present at the parade, that it was not the man holding the gun who got shot. It was the rabbit running away. The wave of murmurs that passed through those ranks was barely controlled. Officers and senior NCOs moved quietly but urgently among the men, and the accounts of those who were present suggest that what they were managing was not simply insubordination. Later, when Blamey toured the field hospital, the wounded men nibbled lettuce and whispered the chorus of a song that had been popular before the war: "Run, rabbit, run." Brigadier Potts wrote to his wife in a letter that survives in the archives. He swore to fry Blamey's soul in the afterlife. Around the same time, Blamey told General MacArthur directly that he preferred to use Australian troops in the coming operations because he knew they would fight. The men he staked his operational planning on were the same men he had publicly accused of cowardice a fortnight earlier. Whether this contradiction reveals cynicism, compartmentalization, or something more complicated about how Blamey understood his own command is a question the historical record leaves open. The facts, set side by side, speak for themselves. Ralph Honor survived. He was the only senior commander of the campaign who retained a battlefield assignment, perhaps because he was too junior to represent a political threat. He led his men through the brutal fighting at Gona on the north coast, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and later commanded the 2nd 14th Battalion through subsequent campaigns until severe wounds in the Ramu Valley in 1943 ended his active service. He left the Army in early 1945. In civilian life, he served as Australia's ambassador to Ireland from 1969 to 1972. He died on the 14th of May, 1994, aged 89. At his funeral, an unidentified Japanese veteran approached the coffin and bowed in deep and silent respect. The 39th Battalion was disbanded on the 3rd of July, 1943. Its numbers, reduced by disease and battle to below the threshold of practical reorganization, could not sustain the unit's survival. The battalion that had arguably done more than any other single formation to preserve Port Moresby in the campaign's opening weeks ceased to exist as a military body less than a year after doing so. Its personnel were redistributed among other units. The regimental colors went into storage. The final human cost ran to approximately 625 Australians killed on the Kokoda Track, with over 1,600 wounded. The disease evacuations, 4,857 men by late December, dwarfed the combat casualty figures by a ratio that reflects how much of this war was fought not against the Japanese, but against the mountains themselves. The Japanese survivors who staggered back to the beachheads arrived, as witnesses recorded, naked or in rags and in near-skeletal condition from starvation. The soldiers who had seemed unstoppable in July were finished as a fighting force by November. The Papuan carriers who made the campaign survivable at all have never received the recognition their contribution required. They were called the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, a name that originated in a soldier's poem published in the Brisbane Press in 1942 and was amplified by Damien Parer's extraordinary newsreel footage, and they carried the wounded down the track through conditions that the historical record strains to describe. Medical reports documented their care with clinical precision. They carried stretchers over seemingly impassable terrain, made their patients as comfortable as possible, fetched water, provided food regardless of their own needs, and slept 4 to each side of the stretcher through the night so that any movement from the patient would be immediately attended to. No known living casualty was ever abandoned by the carriers. Not one. The full picture is more complicated than the legend allows, and the complication matters. Many of those carriers were not volunteers. They were conscripted by the Australian military administration in Papua, compelled to perform this labor. After the war, they received minimal recognition and minimal compensation for decades. The most celebrated carrier, Raphael Oimbari, whose photograph with a wounded Australian soldier became one of the war's most reproduced images, received a single one-time payment equivalent to approximately 500 Australian dollars. The last surviving angel, Havala Laula, died on Christmas Eve, 2017. He had helped carry men down a mountain 75 years earlier. He died without the country those men were defending, having fully acknowledged what that had cost him. Damien Parer filmed the campaign and brought it home. His newsreel, Kokoda Frontline, won Australia's first Academy Award at the 15th Academy Awards in 1943. The images of soldiers' legs churning through ankle-deep mud, the carriers bearing wounded men through impossible terrain, the exhausted faces of the 39th at Minari became the visual language through which Australia came to understand what had happened in those mountains. Parer disobeyed orders to film at the front because he believed the images needed to be seen. He was killed in 1944, filming a U.S. Marine beach assault at Palau, his wife pregnant with their first child. His son, who carries his name, has described his father's work as the Gallipoli of the Second World War, the set of images through which a generation learned what their country had nearly lost. The historical debate about what Kokoda actually was continues in Australian academic circles. A significant revisionist study published in 2012 argued that the traditional narrative of overwhelming Japanese numerical superiority was overstated, and that at some engagements, including Isurava, the infantry numbers on both sides were closer to equal than the legend claimed. The counter-argument, made by veterans, advocates, and a substantial body of military historians, is that comparing raw infantry headcounts while ignoring the Japanese artillery advantage produces a fundamentally misleading picture. An army with mountain guns, heavy machine guns, and mortars facing an army with none is not equal when their infantry numbers match. The artillery caused 35% of all Australian casualties. The argument that arithmetic parity in infantry equaled parity of force ignores the most lethal weapon on the battlefield. Both analyses contain facts. Neither contains the whole truth. Yoshihara's verdict does. The Japanese chief of staff, who had watched his force disintegrate across the Owen Stanley Range, gave his assessment of the men who stopped it. In the Kokoda battle, the Australian soldiers' qualities of adaptability and individual initiative enabled them to show tremendous ability as fighting men in the jungle. They were superb. That judgment came from the man who had sent the army that tried to break them. It arrived without qualification. At Minari Village on the 6th of September, 1942, Ralph Honor addressed what remained of the 39th as they were relieved from the line. Now, I don't know a lot of you by name, but I know you. We met at Isurava. We fought there together, and every step of the way here. Now we are relieved, and we will leave the battle. And every day the enemy's supply line stretches further. He suffers now, as you have suffered. The battle we fought for the track may have just saved your nation. He paused. I want you to know that you are some of the finest soldiers that I have ever seen. You have seen things in this place that no man should witness. Some of these things you must forget, but history will remember you, and in the years to come, others will wish that they had your conviction. He was right. History did remember. It took a long time to begin. As the 39th marched back toward Port Moresby, ragged, reduced, carrying the visible marks of what the mountains had done to them, a unit of fresh troops moving in the opposite direction called out across the gap between the columns, "Who's that mob?" The reply came back without a pause. "We are not a mob. We are the 39th. At Isurava, 4 granite pillars stand in the jungle where the fighting was heaviest. Each carries a single word: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. They are the words the Australians who chose them believed could hold what had happened there. And they are right, though they only barely hold it. The boys the Australian Army called chocolate soldiers proved something in those mountains that the institution which sent them there had not believed possible. They proved it without adequate training, without artillery, without proper supply, and without the support of the men who should have stood behind them. They proved it through the quality that Honor had seen in B Company when his second-in-command had seen only failure, a refusal, not strategic or calculated, but simply human and absolute, to stop fighting. The chocolate soldiers did not melt. They dug in with bully beef tins and bayonets and steel helmets in the rain and the cold and the dark, and they held the line until the line could be held no longer, and then they fell back and held the next one, and the one after that, until the army that had never been stopped ran out of everything it needed to keep going. Prime Minister Paul Keating said, kneeling at the Kokoda Memorial in 1992, that this campaign should rank above Gallipoli in the Australian national consciousness, because here, for the first time in the nation's history, Australians had died on Australian soil. The official histories barely mentioned the 39th Battalion in their indexes. The unit that held the line in the campaign's critical opening weeks was disbanded and dispersed before the war was over. That gap between what those boys did and what they were given for doing it does not diminish what they achieved. It makes the achievement stranger, lonelier, and more worth knowing about. Tell me in the comments which part of this story you had never heard before. And if you want to know what happened to the men who walked off that track and tried to go home, That story deserves its own film, and one day we will make it.